They don't come here to attack us because we're rich and we're free. They come and they attack us because we're over there.
We don't need to go populist left or populist right. We don't need to embrace neo-Marxism or neo-fascism, these disastrous movements from the 20th century. Turns out the answer is pretty much our Bill of Rights, our story. Embrace freedom. That's the answer.
And if the LP has a purpose, it's not to put people to sleep. It's to wake them up.
We're here because we love liberty, and we're here because we hate injustice. We are here to save mankind. We are here to fight.
Join us, the Libertarian Party, in perhaps the most exciting, grandest endeavor in history, the restoration of American liberty.
Ideas spread, they can't stop them. An idea whose time has come cannot be stopped by any army or any government.
Hello and welcome to episode 88 of Decentralized Revolution, a podcast from the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus and a Mises PAC. I'm Aaron Harris, and I'm your host. Today, I have on a guest to talk about the reason I thought to have him on was Joe Biden's, V for Vendetta speech condemning the MAGA Republicans, and there's a very troubling type thing, and puts us libertarians in kind of a weird spot because we don't like Trump at all. And but we realize that a lot of times when people like Biden attack Trump, they are really sort of attacking anyone who doesn't go along with everything that the Biden administration, sort of the American elite kind of want. And so I was thinking how bizarre that speech was, just the optics of it and some of the things he said, and wanted to talk to someone who has a good handle on how politicians speak, how things are presented, how propaganda and messaging kind of work in politics, and someone who has a really good grounding in how that sort of thing has played out in history. And CJ Killmer popped into my mind because a couple of recent episodes of his Dangerous History podcast, which is a really excellent podcast, he talked about presidential historians who met with Biden to talk about, this critical juncture and danger to democracy that we're at right now. And he posted an episode of a talk he gave to Tom Woods School of Life, in which CJ breaks down kind of the history of propaganda, how it works, how to spot it. And while listening to both of those episodes, I was like, hey, CJ would be the perfect person to talk about the Biden thing with. And CJ is just great to talk to anyway about just about anything. And as you kind of will see here in a minute, we get into the episode kind of in a weird way. Usually I kind of click record as we're talking to get levels and things like that. And then we kind of pause and then we start recording. But this time I clicked record and CJ was just saying interesting things. So we kind of have a weird, you're going to kind of get into the conversation a little bit after it's already started. So I apologize. That might be a little rough edit there. But I know you're going to enjoy this talk. CJ, of course, is the host of the Dangerous History podcast, and he has some great news to share, namely that he has finally done something he's been planning on doing for a few years, or at least thinking about it, and that is going full-time as a freelance self-ownership podcaster. He quit his job teaching in academia so he can go full-time into the Dangerous History podcast. He's had a lot of people support him, and I just think it's great. And if you want to support CJ, find out more about him and the Dangerous History podcast, go over to decentralizedrevolution.com/88. That's our show notes page. You will find out a lot about him there, and I'll have a link to if you want to support what he's doing. Also, a technical issue. Every once in a while, I think I forget to flip the right switch, and my backup microphone kind of kicks in and grabs it. And I think that's what's going on during this episode. The sound on my end isn't quite as good as it usually is, but it's good enough to hear. So I apologize if it's not as pleasing as it usually is, but I know you're going to enjoy what Prof. CJ has to say.
People, last few years of the 70s and the first few years of the 80s. And which is like, to me, that it's like a micro generation, because, generations normally you're talking like 18 to 20 year, slot. But this is sort of just talking about like a span of maybe like 5 years or whatever. People from like, I don't know, 77 to 83 or something.
Yeah.
And we were the people that were in this spot where we had a mostly analog childhood still. Because, computers and the internet, they existed, but like hardly anybody had them, especially in their homes.
Yep.
And then, by the time we were teenagers, we had sort of the first version of the mass internet. And then, we got so we're, we weren't born with the internet being like a common thing that most people even knew much about.
Right.
Like the last people to still have that kind of like Stranger Things-esque sort of childhood.
Yeah.
So.
I went ahead and hit record, so I got
Sure.
that chunk that was neat. So I think we're just gonna do a messy beginning here.
Hey,
but
I don't think.
Yeah. It's interesting as someone who I was born in 75, so like a lot of just having that fully analog childhood until, well, really, I remember in like early high school, like we started like teaching us how to program on like MS-DOS and stuff like that. So from there to where we are now. And this has been a kind of a pet theory of mine, and you might have an opinion on this, that, in the beginning, the internet seemed to me to be very, decentralized and, a force for liberation. And you could be, maybe you never could, I don't know, but like, I think you could be fairly anonymous on the internet. And, my first experience really was in college with like the Usenet message boards and stuff like that. And, a very different world than it is today with social media. And I remember several years ago, it's 15 plus years ago or so now, there was the big buzzword was Web 2.0. And like moving to all the social media stuff, MySpace and it started with like Friendster. I was on Friendster. I don't know, I'm that old. And then Facebook. And it seems to me like that whole movement, and knowing what we know now about some of the intelligence agencies and stuff like that, it seems like it was a orchestrated thing to kind of put the internet into pens, together people into more trackable, more sort of manageable elements. Am I onto anything there? Do you have opinions on that?
I think so. There's definitely something there. I mean, I can't say it's something that I've personally dug really deep into, but I've heard and read enough that it certainly seems like there have been intelligence agency connections to a lot of the biggest tech companies of today, going back to their beginnings. Companies like Facebook, Google, definitely. It seems like there's some degree of covert, three-letter mafia involvement from like the get-go of some of those companies. Yeah. And it also, it's a very similar, I'm actually working on an episode right now talking a little bit about film history and things like the Hays Code, where the film industry censored itself in part to kind of preempt the government from coming in and censoring them from outside.
Yeah.
And one pattern that I always see, at least in American history, and I would assume probably in other countries' history too, I just haven't delved into it, is that very often when you get a new communications medium technology, in the opening phases of it, it's wildly free. It's like the stereotypical, Wild West, like people talk about the uncensored, uncontrolled internet days. And you see this pattern with radio, you see this pattern with film, you see it later with television, where, for the first X number of years that that communications media exists, it's little to no regulation from the state, and also it's very competitive and decentralized in terms of the various firms and companies.
Yep.
So, like the early days of radio, pretty much almost all radio was pirate radio.
Right.
And similar with motion picture, like a lot of people don't realize that the first few decades of motion pictures, there was very little to nothing in the way of like either state control from without or cartelization from within.
Yep.
And so, for example, films in the 19 teens and 20s were often very much more explicit than the films of the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Yeah.
And so, just to use film as an example, because I've been recording segments for that upcoming episode just the past week. In the 30s, the film industry created this motion picture production code known as the Hays Code to tightly control the content of American, studio films. And it was partly the big companies themselves, as often happens, right? They want to cartelize their own industry. Right. And so it was partly that, and partly I think they felt like, well, we'd rather censor ourselves than have the government censor us, and maybe not always in ways that we want. And then also it was a case of they were trying to clean up their image because there were some scandals in the 19 teens and 20s.
Oh, yeah.
and so, yeah, they were trying to like get out in front of a lot of their scandals. But, it's the same pattern then you see with the internet, where in the early days, it's like wildly free, virtually unregulated. And yeah, there are some negative aspects to that, but then a combination of the government wants to get control of it, and the largest firms in the industry also want to drastically reduce competition, cartelize things, and so forth. And, as I know and probably, all your listeners know, this idea that even some libertarians sometimes push that like, oh, big business and big government are always antagonistic to each other. It's just not true.
Yeah.
It's just not true. More often than not, the interests of the biggest corporations dovetail quite nicely with the interests of the state. I mean, you get into this like neo-fascistic corporatist sort of a morass that we're in now. But again, you could just see that happening in industry after industry, whether it's radio, film, television, and now the internet. So yeah. So I think part of it might be intelligence infiltration and whatever, for sure, at least in the case of the internet.
Yeah.
And certainly the military and intelligence have been involved in TV and movies for many decades at this point.
Yeah.
But part of it also is just this natural pattern of trying to get control over something when it's new and wildly free.
Right. And I think that you hit on something there on the whole, perceived antagonism between big business and government. And I think as libertarians, we, people who look at us from the outside, and also to a lesser extent, I think internally, I think a lot of that comes from Ayn Rand, right? Like that she very idealized the businessman, the inventor, the industrialist. And in a perfect world, those guys like Hank Rearden, would be like Hank Rearden was, right? But in real life, a lot of those guys, they did, it was kind of, I hate the term, the Wild West. You could do a podcast on that, but the Wild West was actually more anarchic and safer than I think people think it was. But I think that these guys, once they get some success, then once you're on top, you obviously want to preserve your position there. And it's very easy to say, oh, well, what can I do? Well, I know this congressman and he can help me, these upstarts. And so like you use the example of radio, like it was all basically pirate radio. It's like, oh, let's figure out how to do this. Oh, I'm up, I'm blasting at 500,000 watts or whatever. And then, certain things happen that, a few people get a little bit of capital, they want to preserve that, they go to the government and, oh, now we have the FCC, right? And it's under the guise of, well, we can't have, radio signals, jamming each other. We have to sort this out. And it's not, it's not like land. We don't have these easy ways to demarcate things. So of course we need government. And, then we end up with what is a big element of fascism. So And then I think the government is kind of always on the back end of that. And then once the businessman, I think, initiates that stuff, then the government, then it becomes this dance of who's proposing what laws to make an industry more regulated. And one thing that really frustrates me as a libertarian is especially people on the left talking about income inequality and stuff like that. And it's like, yeah, well, fix the money, base it on gold or something, that the market decides, and get rid of this regulation, and you won't have this stratification. I mean, certainly not in the way we have now. So,
yeah. Well, there's a great book. Maybe you've heard of it. It's a fairly concise little book, but it was one of the first books that really kind of opened my eyes to this whole idea of, that big businesses and big businessmen are very often not in favor of the free market, contrary to what the left often says. Well, first off, all you have to do is look at where do the biggest corporations give their money, right? They're not giving their money to the Mises Institute and people like that. They're giving it to these very statist kind of political causes and think tanks. But great little book, The Myth of the Robber Barons by Burton Folsom, which really, I think, does a good job of laying out this idea of you have to differentiate between market entrepreneurs who are, people just really trying to succeed in the marketplace by doing right by their customers and, creating better products at better prices, versus those who are political entrepreneurs who are either trying to gain success or trying to make their success permanent by buying politicians and rigging the rules and cartelizing their industry. And very often the same person, the same businessman or the same company will start as a market entrepreneur.
Yep.
And then once they get big and successful, now suddenly they change their mind about competition. And a great example of this is John D. Rockefeller with Standard Oil, where if you look at the earliest phases of Standard Oil, he was initially successful just by running his company better than any other petroleum company was run at the time. He just, had an obsession with efficiency and always figuring out how to drop the price. And he single-handedly dropped the price of petroleum to the consumer massively. And but then once Standard Oil became, one of the biggest oil companies in the world, suddenly, he starts having second thoughts about competition. And even famously later in his career, John D. Rockefeller said, competition is a sin.
Yeah.
So, and partly I think it's a natural tendency, right? Of like, if you're the new upstart, hungry young fighter, like all you want is a fair shot at the belt, right?
Yep.
But then it's very tempting as soon as you win the title to be like, whoa, now I think maybe we ought to just hit the pause button on the status quo, which just coincidentally happens to be with me on top with the belt, and suddenly like, oh, competition doesn't sound very, very cool anymore because you're the top dog and every young hungry fighter is gunning for you. And so, sometimes I think it's that. Sometimes I don't think every entrepreneur who gets big and successful of their own accord just decides against competition. I think sometimes it's defensive, right? Because if you're, let's say, you come to be a dominant firm in some industry and you are like ideologically and philosophically committed to the idea of free market competition and all that. But if all your competitors are playing the political game, you might have to start buying politicians just initially as a matter of self-defense,
Right.
And so, you can hate the player sometimes, but if the game is corrupt, I think you ultimately have to hate the game more than anything else.
Yeah, you end up in a situation like we are today with someone like Elon Musk, who, if you look at him from one angle, he's like this libertarian hero. And if you look at him from another angle, he's like a statist Bond villain,
Yeah. And I think it's virtually impossible to become a billionaire without having to play the state game to some extent. Like, I just don't think that that's possible. I think you can be a millionaire and even a significant multimillionaire just through being a market entrepreneur. But there's a certain level at which, as an individual or your company as a company, given the current system being what it is, where I immediately, when I see a giant corporation or, a multi-billionaire or whatever, I immediately like, at least some of what you've done is, what I would consider at least, immoral, even if it's not illegal, because there's no way you can get that big and successful in the current system without doing things that I would at least consider, morally shifty.
Yeah. Do you think it's a coincidence, but I think a lot of, you talked about Edward Bernays in your recent episode of your podcast, which was a talk to Tom Wood's School of Life, and we'll have that linked on the show notes page, decentralizedrevolution.com/88, about propaganda. And, I think a lot of that, I think probably it had to do with, like, again, emerging technologies of radio and stuff, that certain modern techniques of propaganda started happening. But it kind of started happening toward the later end of that so-called robber baron period, that I think on a mass scale, some of that propaganda got going. And I think what we kind of ended up with was this, the standard view of American history, that it was, this, especially the 1800s, that it was, untamed capitalism, but then the progressives came along and kind of tamed it. And isn't this great that we took, the excesses of the market and found this third way, and the 20th century, was so great. They always leave out World War I and II, and even sort of spin those, especially World War II, as a triumph. And so you get this odd sort of, again, it's the mainstream history, but what I would consider is an alternate false history of kind of the relationship between government and business and culture and stuff like that. I think that's all. There's a lot of stuff there for a libertarian to look at.
Yeah, and a huge part of my intellectual development on this was Rothbard's work on this sort of stuff, and then also a lot of the guys that he sort of built upon, particularly a lot of the early New Left historians. And by New Left, I mean like 1950s, 60s. People like Gabriel Kolko, who Rothbard gave credit to some of those, and some other kind of left-wing, at least somewhat Marxist-ish historians, but they were very good on this whole idea of corporatism and this whole idea of, as I've heard Scott Horton put it, that progressivism is basically a scam for corporatism, at least kind of like the dominant strain of progressivism.
Yeah.
And it's the same progressives that, they'll have anti-corporate rhetoric, but that's as far as it goes, really. Yeah. And 99% of the time, they're doing exactly what the big corporations want them to do. They're happily taking their money. And also, I think not coincidentally, these same kind of like dominant progressives also tend to be, despite their rhetoric, very, very hawkish on war. They tend to be terrible on civil liberties. They tend to be big proponents of the police state. And it's sort of like this line that runs from like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson on through someone like FDR, on through someone like Lyndon Johnson, and ultimately to people like Barack Obama and Joe Biden, where it's like, they're progressive, but they're very different from what I would consider like an independent, relatively good progressive, like a Robert La Follette back in the World War I era, who I wouldn't agree with all of his economic ideas, but at least he wasn't a complete corporate tool. And, he was adamantly opposed to the U.S. being in World War I. He was adamantly opposed to Wilson's violations of civil liberties during World War I. And then, right up, there's always been this like, kind of like minority, the modern version of this would be people like Jimmy Dore, Matt Taibbi, some of these other, like, they're left wing, but they're not at all like Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden left wing, and they're good on a lot of the most important issues. But the dominant strain of American progressivism has always been corporatist. And all you got to do is look back at, who's supporting Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt, who's funding their campaigns. It's a bunch of, JP Morgan types. In some cases, it's, one of Teddy Roosevelt's closest political advisors and staunchest financial supporters of his political career was a guy named George W. Perkins, who was literally a business partner of JP Morgan. He was one of the primary funders of the Bull Moose Party for Teddy Roosevelt to run again for the presidency in 1912. This is literally JP Morgan's business partner. So it's sort of like that idea that big business and big government are always opposed to each other is false. Same thing, the idea that like big businessmen are always ideologically against, interventionist economic policies, and they're always ideologically in favor of the free market. That's simply the opposite of reality. You know,
Yeah.
there's way more people in the Morgan orbit in the early 20th century or in the Rockefeller orbit. Way more of them are likely to support, you know, big government politicians than laissez-faire types.
Yeah. Howard Zinn, what's I forget the name. People's History of the United States is kind of comes at it from that angle too. Like some of the stuff in there is just brain dead, horrible Marxism, but like a lot of it, you know, like a lot of Marxists, they kind of get what's wrong kind of correct mostly, and then they have like a horrible, even worse solution to the problem. But I think it's good that there are people again like Jimmy Dore, Caitlin Johnstone, people like that who are leftist and who are, you know, Tulsi Gabbard, bad on a lot of things, but at least they, on some of the big things, that they're not, you know, completely blind to what's going on. And I guess this kind of dovetails a little bit into, you know, being able to recognize propaganda and stuff, which was kind of the point of your talk that is the recent episode on Dangerous History podcast. Is it's really amazing. You know, the good propaganda is the stuff that people don't even notice. And so again, as libertarians, a lot of stuff that we're arguing about and that we're trying to get people to see, they just don't see it because they've been it sounds patronizing to say this, and maybe we're wrong in some cases, but like, you know, we just had the 9/11 anniversary and stuff like that, and just seeing, you know, people on social media kind of, you know, parroting the same sort of, you know, Rudy Giuliani view of that. And it's very difficult to wake people up from, you know, a lifetime of, you know, the media, education, everything, giving them one version of how the world works. And it's hard to get people to realize that, and even if they do realize that, to make a change, because at that point if they do begin to suspect they've been lied to, the last thing they want to do is admit it, right?
Yeah. I mean, psychologically, that's tough to do, is to admit that you've been conned, and partly it's because people, I think most people have a natural tendency towards this, but then I think it's also encouraged by the way most people are raised and educated in the institutions that we live in, is to invest your identity and sense of personal worth with what you believe.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do that, and I do think most people do that at least to some extent, and some people do it like really blatantly. If you do that, then the problem is that you feel like any, you know, potential exposure of holes in what you believe is an attack on you. And I'm trying to think. It was either, I guess it was Plato, but speaking through Socrates in, I can't remember if it was the Republic or the Gorgias, one of Plato's books, where basically Socrates says that it's like it's better to be proven that you're wrong about something than to be proven that you're right about something you believe. Because if you're proven to be right, like, you haven't really gained anything. Whereas if someone shows you that you're wrong about something and corrects you, then you've been improved. Mm-hmm. Because now something that you used to believe that was faulty, you can no longer believe. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I guess if more people had the temperament and mindset of Socrates, we'd be better off as far as this goes. People to have the detachment, right, to be able to, when they're exposed to things that seem to show that something they believed is just wrong, to not take it as a personal attack, but instead to go, oh, wow, you know what, if I'm wrong, that's good. You know, it's good that, in other words, if I'm wrong, it's good that someone is showing me, in the same way that, like, if you were ill but didn't realize it, like if you had some disease growing in you that wasn't causing you symptoms yet, like, wouldn't you want someone to test for it and show you, so that you can maybe do something about it, and then you'd be better off, versus, you know, just being clueless that there's something wrong with you. Yeah, the metaphor I used a little bit in that talk, and that I've used a lot lately in talking about propaganda, is malware. that it's invisible malware. And malware is always most effective the more invisible it is, right? Because obviously, if your computer gets infected with some malware, but it's like really blatant, like there's giant neon colored pop-ups saying like, you've just been infected with such and such. Well, then you're immediately aware and maybe you can get it fixed or at least replace your computer or who knows what, right? Whereas if the malware is completely silent and invisible and it's doing whatever it's doing to your system and you have no idea, well, it's going to be able to do whatever it's doing for a very long time and get away with it. And so, yeah, I mean, if I sit someone down and go, I'm now going to propagandize you, and, you know, try and bludgeon you into believing something, like immediately, even someone who's a pretty blue pill dummy, their defenses are going to go up and they're going to actually try and be a little bit of a critical thinker and whatever. Whereas if it's something completely innocuous seeming, and they've gotten better at it over time. You know, if you, I've been studying a lot of World War I propaganda for many years, especially lately working on a mini series of that. And if you look back, like a lot of the World War I era propaganda seems so obvious and ham-fisted and heavy-handed and all that from today's perspective. But it's like, yeah, they've had over 100 years to keep refining it and making it slicker and slicker and slicker. So of course, the stuff from 100 years ago, we look back at now and go, oh, didn't everybody realize this was such obvious propaganda? It's like, well, some people did, but most people didn't. And, you know, they've only refined their craft, you know, for the last century plus. And, you know, I wonder if more people ever do wake up to all this stuff in 100 years from now, right? How will the propaganda that 90% of people just chug uncritically all day long, how much of it 100 years from now will people look back on and go, really? Yeah. Really? Most people believe this crap? Most people let their minds be affected by this obvious, blatant, stupid propaganda?
Well, and this all leads to kind of the idea that I really wanted to talk to you about today in depth was, you know, a week or two ago when, you know, Biden made his, you know, Emperor Palpatine speech or whatever about, you know, oh, the MAGA Republicans are domestic terrorists, basically. You know, my initial reaction was like, oh, just that's nonsense. Nobody believes this. But like even as I was saying that in my head, I was like, you know, just spend a half hour on Twitter and, you know, anytime something, you know, like all this stuff with Trump and the Mar-a-Lago raid and stuff like that, wading into, you know, some leftists, and again, not the good leftists, but the, you know, the NPC types in their takes on this, that, you know, the things they say, and who knows whether some of these people actually believe it. Some of these people are, you know, moderate, you know, internet famous, and, you know, they are craving clicks and all that, but like basically pushing the narrative that Trump is like a literal, you know, spy for the Russians, who these documents got spies killed, and just this, you know, he's treasonous, and thinking that, you know, Trump is not a good guy, but most of that stuff is probably very false, but people believe it very fervently. And if you have a big chunk of the public, and who knows how many people are that fervently turned on to it, or at least passively open to it, like in and of itself, Biden's speech is relatively harmless, and in and of itself, you know, these people believing, you know, wildly stupid, simplified narratives is not that dangerous. But put those two together, and that is, to me, that it is a very, I think it's a strong potential that like really bad stuff can come from this. Like it's just very, again, as a libertarian, I laugh at it, but then I'm like, wait, look, these guys actually do have power, and they have millions of people who believe them, and they are going to, if they have to preserve their power, they're going to start rounding people up. I don't think it's going to get to that very quickly, but we're certainly clearly pointed down that road.
Yeah, well, one thing, and this is, you know, in my mind anyway, still kind of a theory, and I've heard other people kind of articulate versions of this, but one of the first things I thought of when I saw the Dark Brandon speech was they're trying to provoke the other side. Yep. They're trying to provoke an Oklahoma City or something like that. There's no way they could have, I mean, just the optics alone, right? Of, having this red light and the Marines standing, like it's right out of V for Vendetta, as many people have pointed out. It's right out of some like over the top dystopia. How on earth, if the goal was actually to try and quote unquote unify the country more, that's literally the opposite of what you would do, even just in terms of how the speech looked, let alone the content of it, right? Mm-hmm. So, no, it was designed to basically try to provoke the hell out of the other side, in order to get some hothead right winger to say, oh, he's going full, Brandon's going full dictator. Let's go, blow something up or do something else stupid like that. I hope nobody is dumb enough to take the bait on that, because all you got to do is look at the way that Bill Clinton was able to leverage Oklahoma City to increase his poll numbers and his political capital and demonize a lot of his opponents. And I'm sure and probably most of the audience knows that like the Oklahoma City story is way more complicated than most people think, to put it mildly. But it's like I think they're trying to provoke some of the less stable elements of the right into doing something stupid, so that they can then A, crack down and institute even more of a domestic police state, and B, the Democrats can leverage it for their own political, power, and political capital in terms of elections. And honestly, I have no inside track on this, but I am extremely curious if since that speech, the FBI has been upping its, agent provocateur type activities, right? I mean, already there's so much fishy stuff about January 6th. It looks like that was, at least in part, a provocateur, sort of a COINTELPRO type thing. The whole Gretchen Whitmer plot is like almost entirely an FBI thing that they basically created. And so I think the people in charge, they would love it if some right wingers actually would, on their own initiative, fly off the handle and do something stupid and violent. But I would be shocked if they're just leaving it up to that, right? If they're just trying to provoke a genuine incident of some sort. I would, if I were to put a bet on it, I would bet money that the FBI has been, probably ever since Biden took office, but especially since that speech, I would imagine that the COINTELPRO type people within the FBI have been upping their activities and really trying to make stuff happen so that they can, preferably before the midterms, honestly, is what I believe.
So something like that speech sets the stage. It gets people thinking, again, the NPCs and the, people who aren't NPCs, but who are, just normal, passive, swing voters or whatever. This is a possibility. And then the more they do, create a climate where people are going to be upset at Biden, then you're right. Like a lot of those, some of those fake, like the Gretchen Whitmer thing, and a lot of like the Muslim terrorist things, like, they find somebody who has like legitimate mental or developmental intelligence issues, and they almost out of whole cloth make this stuff up, but it helps them if they have someone who actually does have some bit of a true backstory. Going to what you said about propaganda, like there's a lot of the best propaganda has a lot of truth. So you take someone who may be, very anti-government, or, very, have, some fascist interests or something like that. You get somebody like that who has a history of that and push him over the edge, and you've got a much better narrative that seems like much more compelling. And again, it's like, see, we told you, Biden told you, and look at how deep this goes.
Because right now it's very I don't know, right now there's such little evidence objectively that there actually is this like giant increase in hate-based domestic terrorism. When it's like, where's the objective evidence of this? Where's the statistics? Like, what are you talking about? Right now, the blue-pilled, the fully blue-pilled people, they'll just believe whatever, their favorite spokesman tell them to believe. So, but I think there's a lot of, like you were saying, just sort of like regular people who just aren't really that political most of the time, other than like right before an election. And I think that unless there are some actual incidents or incidents the FBI sets up that they can then swoop in and solve at the last second, because of course they created them. If there isn't more real stuff, that a lot of just kind of regular middle of the road people, this whole narrative of this giant increase in domestic violence or violent extremism domestically is simply not going to resonate with them. It's like, if you're warning your little town about witches or whatever, like at some point you better be able to produce something that at least looks like there actually are witches infiltrating your community or something like this. So yeah, I think they want it to happen. And to anybody listening, if you're libertarian, right wing, or anything outside of the regime establishment ideology, like do not play their game. Do not fly off the handle. Do not do anything stupid or violent or whatever like that. And if anybody in any groups you're in or whatever suddenly is like, hey, let's go do something violent, your first thought should be fed.
Yep.
Fed, either the FBI agent or an informant or something, and don't play their game. Don't play their game.
Yeah, it's very I can't stress that enough. Not only just from a moral perspective, but a practical one. Like it's you may think you have justification, and maybe you do, but you don't want the heat that's going to come down on you and on I think. The other people like you. Just look, the January 6th thing is pretty amazing. Like, is there anything I'm trying to think of things in American history that seem to be so again, going back to that other recent episode that made me want to talk to you about this, you did an episode on the presidential historians who supposedly in this very serious meeting with Biden to talk about the future of democracy. And one of them was this guy, Michael Beschloss, who, I remember him from like the, Clinton impeachment stuff. And he's just kind of got this oily hair and this very unctuous delivery. And, he's like perfect casting. And, only Doris Kearns Goodwin is worse. And I wonder if she's just like too old to have gone to that meeting as a side note.
Yeah, I was surprised she wasn't part of it,
But so in the montage you played of his responses to kind of set the scene of who this guy is, a lot of the, pronouncements he's made on presidential, matters over the last 20, 30 years, it's very I'm sure it's scripted. Some of the exchanges he had specifically about January 6th with the news people who were interviewing him, he's very like, oh, this is so unprecedented. And the attack on our democracy and, a coup that almost succeeded and stuff like that. To me, this is one of the biggest, I don't know if you would quite call it a false flag or what it is, because it's this weird hybrid of, again, taking something that was there and turning it into something a little worse, and then calling it the worst thing ever. Like, is there any event in American history, or even like, what is this like? It seems very different and new, maybe just because we're still in it. They're still trying to sell it, but this is I gotta hand it to him on this one. It's kind of creative.
Yeah, I mean, there were some things in kind of the late 19th, early 20th century where, some things that really, in the grand scheme of things, weren't that big of a deal were played up in terms of like, allegedly politically motivated lone nut jobs, like planting a bomb or assassinating somebody or whatever, like when McKinley was assassinated and things like this, where, and I mean, obviously assassinating a president is a real thing, it's not blown out of proportion. Like, that's a big deal. But where, certain people, and you find this like in the earliest phases of J. Edgar Hoover's career at the Justice Department, where instead of looking at it more objectively and going, yeah, this guy did kill the president, and obviously that's a big deal, but at the same time, one mentally ill person pulling off something like that is not proof that there's like this giant back then, a conspiracy of violent anarchists who are just going to assassinate all of our leaders and overthrow our government next week. It's like, no, there was, maybe one lone nut in that case, if that is actually what it was, pulled one off. Same deal as like, I mean, obviously 9/11 was a big deal in terms of the damage of those buildings and all the people killed and whatever. Like, that was legitimately a big deal. But notice how even with 9/11, as big of a deal as it was objectively, they leveraged it in the aftermath to make it seem even bigger than that, right? They basically spent the next several years telling us constantly that basically like Al-Qaeda was hiding under everybody's bed, and like, the way they were talking about it, you would have assumed we'd have a 9/11 every other week, from now on, and it never really happened. And so, in a way, even something as objectively a big deal as 9/11, they still made it into a bigger thing than it was. But there's another one that comes to mind is I think it was not long after World War I ended, some sort of political radical group, and I forget all the details. I'll eventually be covering it in my Woodrow Wilson series, but some kind of political radical planted a bomb at the Attorney General's home. The Attorney General under Wilson was a guy named A. Mitchell Palmer, and the bomb, I don't think anyone was killed. Obviously it damaged his home. I think some people might have been injured. But then, and by that point, I think Wilson had his big stroke to where he was like, maybe even more asleep at the wheel than Brandon is right now. And basically Attorney General Palmer decided he was just going to go nuts against any political dissidents he didn't like in the aftermath of that. And he authorized what are known as the Palmer raids, which, going after any kind of political radical individual or group who was prominent at all. And this was the beginning of J. Edgar Hoover's rise to power. This is sort of also the era of what's sometimes called the First Red Scare in the aftermath of the Bolsheviks taking over in Russia. There was this moral panic of, there's commies hiding under everybody's bed about to overthrow the government. This gets wrapped up with the Attorney General's house got bombed, and J. Edgar Hoover was put in charge of, I forget what it was formerly called, but basically the Justice Department task force that carried out the Palmer raids. That was really the beginning of his career, and then not too long after that, he's becoming head of the FBI and holds that job for whatever 50 some odd years. Yeah. So. That's maybe somewhat similar to January 6th in that it was something that was blown out of proportion and was opportunistically leveraged to go after anyone the government didn't like, whether they had anything at all to do with that bombing or not. Yeah. Obviously, when you're bombing the Attorney General's house is a bigger deal objectively than what happened on January 6th at the cosplay riot. But, but it's at least somewhat similar in terms of, something that in the grand scheme of things, all right, one... and I don't remember honestly whether it was just one individual or a group or whatever behind the bombing, but either one person or one small group of crazies planted a bomb somewhere. Like, that's not, even if they had killed the Attorney General, it's not like the U.S. government would have been overthrown the next day, right? In the same way that, like, even as many people have pointed out, like, even if they managed, the January 6th rioters managed to get their hands on Mike Pence and force him to say, I'm not certifying the election, like. Does anyone who's not just repeating regime propaganda, does anyone really believe if that had happened, that would have resulted in the election actually being overturned? I mean, it's silly.
Yeah, taking that narrative past, that evening is it just doesn't make any sense. Let's see. So I'm trying to. There's still a lot of stuff we could talk about, but I'm
good for like another 20 so minutes, something like that.
Okay, yeah. What about presidents in particular? How they have used propaganda and rhetoric and stuff like that to get what they want. Who was most effective of that at that in the time that they did it? There are some presidents who, like Teddy Roosevelt, I think is, retroactively the court historians have made a lot of his stuff to be even more effective than it was at the time. But who do you think was particularly pernicious at doing more subtly what Biden is trying to do rather clumsily, I think?
I think Woodrow Wilson was a master of using rhetoric in particular, and Wilson he was very good at kind of like tacking back and forth between sounding very kind of like liberal in the broad sense of the word, and then identifying enemies, that sort of thing. So, in the same, his most important speech probably is his speech where he goes to Congress in April of 1917 and asks them to put the United States into World War I. And a lot of the speech is this very idealistic sounding stuff about, oh, we have to go to war to save democracy. Mm-hmm. And this is about, the right of every nation to choose its own government. And it's about the rights of small countries to not be bullied by bigger countries. And like all these things that sound so noble and whatever. And those parts of the speech have been almost virtually like plagiarized by every president since when they're getting the U.S. into war. Like you can go, look at the speeches that George W. Bush gave on the eve of invading Iraq. And I mean, he's basically just, echoing Wilsonian talking points from World War I as far as why we got to do this.
Right.
But then in the same speech, he's got these authoritarian things where he says, because in the same speech where he basically asked Congress to declare war, he also, I believe, if I remember right, in the very same speech, he asked Congress to pass a military conscription bill, which they did in short order, and he also asked Congress to pass basically laws against the First Amendment, and this would be the Espionage and Sedition Acts that were passed during World War I, and in that speech, he has a line where, amongst all this other stuff about, oh, we're spreading democracy and fighting for freedom and whatever, he says, but, we can't let the American people, we can't let the traitors in our midst sabotage us in this noble crusade. And I think the exact quote buried in that speech, there's a line where he says, if there be disloyalty, it will be dealt with the firm hand of repression.
Yeah.
And I think that's a virtually a verbatim quote from that speech, if I remember right.
Yeah.
And so he could very slickly go back and forth between sounding all friendly and idealistic and then identifying enemies. Yeah. And pointing the state and private institutions at them to silence them. And so to me, that's someone like that is often more dangerous of an authoritarian because most of the time they don't really sound like an authoritarian. They don't sound like they're given Hitler speeches and Mussolini speeches and whatever. Most of the time they sound like they're small L liberal. And so, another one more recently that comes to mind in that regard, who was very slick at that, was Bill Clinton. Very, very slick at that. And so, I would urge people, if they don't remember, go back and listen to some of the stuff he said, like in the aftermath of Oklahoma City bombing, where he basically wanted to, say that like everybody to the right of like a Mitt Romney Republican was basically responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing. And he very much, opportunistically leveraged that for his own political purposes. So they're very good. Obama definitely had the skills. He, didn't do as much obvious authoritarian things during his presidency as Biden has already been doing in his. But that might have just been due to circumstance and because he was able to do so much kind of quietly, low key, like the NDAA that, gave the executive all these new powers and things like that. But a lot of what was going on during Obama's presidency was like setting up this turnkey authoritarianism, which in a way was a project that, all presidents since Teddy Roosevelt have contributed to virtually, with the exception of maybe like Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge. But definitely the W. Bush years, a lot of that was happening. At least during the W. Bush years, though, a fair amount of the left was good on those things like civil liberties. Now, wasn't because they were, most of them, philosophically committed to those ideas. It was more just playing politics. And all we have to do is look at, what they did once Obama came in and continued to build this turnkey authoritarian regime. Suddenly the left was no longer paying attention and calling these things out. Suddenly it was all fine.
That's something I'd like to learn more about and understand how that happened. Is how the left went from being very rabidly anti-war. Again, if you're younger than 30, you may not remember, but there were like huge, like million people. That may be exaggerating a little bit, but like Grant Park in Chicago, and was full and overflowing of people protesting the war. There were things like that in London and a few others here in the States, and it was very, people were. I just remember even in like conversation, like people were the leftists at that time were very outspoken and annoying for a good cause. But, you wonder, what their real motives were, because like literally that all, I don't know how they did it, and the answer may be obvious, but like, that once Obama gets elected, they seem completely uninterested in war at all. And then 12 years later, they're literally beating the war drums for, Ukraine and Taiwan and things like that. That's got to be whoever pulled that off managed to, get them so worked up under Bush and get them totally turned around. Like that's, there's a book there or a podcast series for some historian who could outline that.
Yeah. And there's various stories out there that, Obama and even I think his parents had like intelligence agency connections.
Really?
And, I gotta say, I haven't delved deeply enough into that to know a lot or have a lot of opinion as to what might be true and what isn't. But it certainly seems suspicious. For sure, the Clintons have been connected to intelligence at least since the time that Bill was governor of Arkansas in the 80s, going back to the whole Barry Seal, Mena, Arkansas, Iran-Contra stuff going on. Like Clinton was in on that, and that was a CIA op. So I think most American presidents since World War II, most of them have been either wittingly or unwittingly fronts for the various intelligence agencies. And I think some of them are in on it and know that's what they are and are actively participating. And some of them are kind of like unwitting sock puppets of those people. But I think that's the case with Obama. And again, younger people might not know this, but if you go back and look at Obama's first run for the presidency in like 07, 08, he sounded like one of these, what we would consider good progressives, right? He sounded great on war. He sounded great on civil liberties. He sounded great on opposing like corporate welfare and corporate bailouts, like all these things. He sounded like a good left winger. And then, of course, he came in and governed not significantly different from George W. Bush in terms of his actual policies. And, drug his feet winding down the war in Iraq and really was kind of forced into that against his own wishes in a lot of ways, and never ended the war in Afghanistan, didn't undo any significant aspects of like the Patriot Act and all that, re-upped all that stuff continuously throughout his presidency, didn't, shut down Gitmo and stop torture and all these sorts of things. And so, yeah, I mean, he was a complete fraud as far as that goes. Yep. And yeah, he was perfect. He was perfect. The progressive establishment had decided, for just kind of, I think, just sort of like pure partisan reasons and for reasons of his declining popularity, that it was time to politically throw George W. Bush under the bus. And so Obama was the perfect antidote to it, because here's this, somewhat younger, very charming, charismatic guy. And he's like, a guilty upper class liberal's wet dream, right? He's this very likable black guy that now you can assuage your white guilt by voting for him and feel like you've done your penance for your ancestors' crimes.
He's America's black friend. That's how he got elected.
Yeah. And he put a charming face on American empire and the American police state. People, most progressives felt like, well, I don't really care if there's wars and drone strikes and Patriot Act and torture and whatever, if Obama's in charge of it, because if he's in charge of it, unlike mean old fake Texan George W. Bush, if Obama's in charge of it, then we trust him and we think he's only drone striking people that really deserve it, and he's not going to abuse our civil liberties unless he really has a good reason to protect us and whatever like that. So it was perfect from the standpoint of like the pageantry, the kabuki show that is the presidency. Yeah. And all that. And then, so then, yeah, those same people that totally drunk the Obama Kool-Aid and didn't realize the giant gap between rhetoric and reality of his presidency. Then along comes Trump. And in terms of style, again, in most policies didn't govern that much differently from either Bush or Obama, let's be honest. But in terms of style was drastically different. And so off-putting to the sorts of people who believed in the Obama cult that, it was then easy for the same progressive establishment to turn Trump into the greatest boogeyman of all. And it's also been interesting to watch. I'm sure you've been amused by this as well. The degree to which the establishment, which, is the establishment of this country has been progressive. This corporatist stream of progressivism we talked about earlier has been the default ideology of the American establishment since at least 1912. That's just the reality. And it's been interesting to watch that the progressive establishment basically rehabilitating George W. Bush in their portrayals, because he's not Trump and he has said bad things about Trump, therefore now we talk fondly about him and portray him as this wonderful old guy who wasn't so bad, when while he was president they were calling him literally Hitler and all that sort of stuff. So it just shows you how many people who are blue-pilled NPCs, it really is like 1984, where it's like, we've always been at war with East Asia. People who spent 8 years calling George W. Bush Hitler now speak of him fondly. And they don't even have the feeling of, they're so brainwashed, they don't even feel any tinge of cognitive dissonance. Like they're just completely like, yeah, we've always been at war with East Asia. So,
yeah, it is really amazing. Speaking of propaganda, you mentioned a couple of things in your the Tom Woods talk. What books, movies, do you think people would benefit from looking at to understand propaganda a little better?
In terms of nonfiction type books, definitely Propaganda by Edward Bernays is worth reading, even though some of the specifics he talks about in there are kind of dated, because he wrote it in like the 1920s or 30s, I forget. But it's still worth reading, and definitely there are parts of that book that are kind of timeless. Propaganda, let's see, Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky, and what was his co-author's name on that one? Daniel Herman, something like that. I think that's definitely worth reading. And again, some of the specific things they talk about are dated, but a lot of what they talk about is kind of timeless. And a lot of what they talk about in regard to like old school TV broadcasts and stuff like that is obviously there's still versions of that going on in the age of smartphones and social media. So that's worth reading. Another book with the title Propaganda, I think the subtitle is The Formation of Men's Attitudes, by the 20th century French Christian anarchist Jacques Ellul. Propaganda by Jacques Ellul. That is worth reading. I actually read that for the first time in graduate school when I was doing a research seminar around the theme of propaganda. It was one of the assigned readings and very good. Let's see. Definitely read 1984. And a lot of people they read 1984 like when they're a teenager or something like that, and then they're like, oh yeah, that's it. 1984 is one of those books that is worth revisiting every so many years, because you'll realize like it's even more prescient than you thought. And all the great dystopias are going to have elements of revealing propaganda through fiction. So aside from 1984, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley is worth reading. One of the lesser known dystopias that I always recommend is the book This Perfect Day by Ira Levin. That is a very underappreciated book that I've been recommending to people for years. It's a really good dystopia, and in some ways, at least aspects of it are more accurate to where we are now than 1984 Brave New World, although there's aspects of all three of those books that are, in reality now. And then some of the great, dystopian movies like Demolition Man, which is a little bit more humorous, but also was very prescient from back in the 90s. The original RoboCop movie is worth watching. None of the sequels are worth much. Two was okay in some ways, but not great. And everything after RoboCop 2 is just garbage. Let's see. There's a I think it's a 3-part documentary series by Adam Curtis called The Century of the Self that is worth watching, which deals a lot with like Bernays and that's sort of the main focus of it is Bernays and the creation of modern propaganda. And that's worth watching. The same feeling I always have about Adam Curtis documentaries is like, I think he gets a lot of stuff right, and he does reveal a lot of important kind of hidden histories. And at the same time, I think in pretty much every one of his films that I've seen anyway, he gets some important things, in my opinion, wrong. And so one of the things I remember from the last time I watched Century of the Self is that like he's pretty positive on FDR and FDR's administration, and like basically was arguing that FDR wasn't engaging in like manipulative propaganda and whatever. And I'm just completely not on board with that at all. But it's still, much of it is very good. He does, cover things like Bernays' campaign to entice women to smoke cigarettes in the name of feminism back in the 1920s, which I think I mentioned it in the Tom Woods talk. To me, it's very similar to the ways that like the government and big corporations today use wokeism in order to get you on board with what they're pushing in terms of either products or policies. And so it's like, in the 1920s, you got this flapper kind of like early proto-feminism wave happening. And so at the time, it was very, very rare for women to smoke cigarettes. There was just sort of like a social and cultural taboo against it. Right. And Bernays goes to work for one of the biggest tobacco companies and basically is like, hey, if I can convince women to smoke, I can literally double your customer base overnight. And they're like, all right, go to it. And so he came up with this whole like Torches of Liberty campaign where the message was basically, hey, are you a young, hip, liberated, modern feminist woman? Don't let some man tell you that you can't smoke cigarettes. Show your liberation by lighting up your torch of liberty. It's like, they're literally getting you to smoke, poisonous carcinogens in the name of feminism. So, what else are they pushing in the name of wokeism today that is not good for you, right?
Yeah, what else? I can't hardly think of anything, right? So.
There's another book. It's sort of a more dry history book, but it's worth reading. That's called Munitions of the Mind. That is just a straight up history of propaganda that actually goes all the way back to ancient times. It talks about like ancient forms of propaganda, and then comes right up into, present era. And I don't agree with every take the guy has, but it's pretty good as just like a bird's eye overview of like thousands of years of propaganda. He talks about like everything from the way that like ancient empires, used various propaganda techniques, monuments and buildings and, art and a lot of these things we think about, like the great Roman structures or the great Egyptian structures, like those are propaganda. Those were designed to send a message, right? It's just, those were the media you had to use when 99% of people were illiterate and modern electronic communications technologies didn't exist. It's like, if you want to get your subjects to believe what you want to believe, well, you build giant stone monuments and temples and all that kind of crap is one of the best ways you can do it, right? And then eventually you put the emperor's face on the money and put slogans there about how the emperor's a god, and it's all propaganda. So anyway, Munitions of the Mind is worth reading just to get the broad history of this whole idea.
All right.
And then there's lots of great specific books about like specific time periods and issues. Like I've got literally an entire giant stack of books just about World War I propaganda. So there's a lot of great books about that. As well as World War II propaganda, Cold War propaganda.
I could talk to you all day, but we obviously can't do that. But I want to give you a chance to tell people. A lot of people know the recent developments in your life and how they can help you go forward with that. So why don't you catch people up?
Yeah, so I a month and a half ago, I walked away from academia, from conventional academia anyway, and went fully rogue off the reservation. And I was in academia for 22 years, for 6 years as a student and a graduate student, and then for 16 years teaching college history. And I've been dissatisfied with it for a very long time. But 8 years ago, I started my podcast as just sort of like a side project, and eventually it started making me some all right money, and I developed a little bit of a following. And then near the end of the summer this year, I finally decided like I can't keep working in conventional academia. I can't keep having this eating up so much of my time and energy. It's making me miserable and depressed, and every year, in various ways, it seems to get worse. So I finally had the bright idea of a crowdfunding campaign, and I did it, and it made almost. My original goal was $12,000. It made I forget like 22,000. It made almost double what my goal was, which was just crazy. And so I put in my resignation. I did not go back to teaching this school year, and don't plan on ever going back to that job. And so, yeah, I'm doing Dangerous History podcast and some other projects I have in the works as my full-time gig now. And so, it's still a little bit slow going because I've been bogged down with just dealing with all the different aspects of the transition. Leaving a job you've been at for 16 years is not an easy task, even if you've got the nest egg of the crowdfunding campaign to keep you from being homeless. So, even just nuts and bolts things like I brought home like 1,000 books that I had at my office at work, and now I've got to figure out how to like fit them in my office at home, which already had 1,000 books in it. Just little things like that have just been like eating up an enormous amount of my time and energy, even more so than I expected. But like I'm working on getting my frequency of output ramped up. It's still probably going to be another month or so before that really starts to kick in. But yeah, so Dangerous History podcast, for those of you who've not heard of it, wherever you like to consume your podcast, just put in Dangerous History podcast and you should find it. The website is dangeroushistorypodcast.com. And, I'm currently in the midst of a super long multi-year series about the life and career of Woodrow Wilson and why he's so horrible and he's even worse than you think. And I'm also a little ways into a mini series about World War I propaganda in the United States. I put out the first episode in that, which was my longest episode yet. It was like 5.5 hours, a couple months ago, something like that. That was a huge hit. I got a ton of downloads on that. So, looking forward to putting out part 2 of that series. And I do, standalone episodes as well. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm currently recording segments for an episode about film censorship in America. And I'm calling it something like Hays Code Old and New, something like that. And basically the idea is there was the old Hays Code, right, from the 1930s to the 1960s, which was in many ways super culturally conservative and restrictive to film content on that way. And now there's the new Hays Code, which is basically the wokest straitjacket, where I'm sure everybody listening has noticed, where for the last 5-6 years, holy cow, do 99% of all big budget movie and TV productions follow a very rigid set of guidelines. And it's basically a whole bunch of do's and don'ts that flow out of wokeism. So basically, I'm going to be covering and sharing huge aspects of the original Hays Code, and then kind of sharing with you my fictitious new Hays Code that I think summarizes most of the rules under which current film and TV operates. So yeah, and anybody who wants to support my work ongoing, currently I've got Patreon and Subscribestar up for those who want to contribute on a monthly basis, get some bonus materials and things like that. And I have more ways to support my work coming down the line.
Okay, we'll have those links, decentralizedrevolution.com/88. It's been a pleasure having you on, and I really admire people who have the courage to take a leap like that. And I know I really enjoy your work, and am pleased that you. I'm not surprised at all that you're able to get enough support given the quality of your work. So hopefully a few more people will jump on board. And you're one of my favorite listens, and so keep up the good work.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And yeah, I've been doing this for a little over 8 years now, and so that's the kind of overnight success I am.
Yeah.
But yeah, I fought the long, slow war of attrition as far as getting this thing going, and I think that's what enabled me to have a successful crowdfunding campaign, was that people were able to. I wasn't like most crowdfunding campaigns where I'm like, here's this product that only exists in my head, and I promise if you give me money, I'll do it. It's like, no, I've been doing this for 8 years. You can look at what I've done and just imagine what more I could do if I no longer had this albatross of having to work in conventional academia for most of my working hours. So yeah, thank you. It's been really amazing and exhilarating to go rogue.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to all the new content. So thanks for coming on.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
And there you have it. I'd like to thank Professor C.J. Killmer for his time and wisdom and accommodating me on short notice, coming on to talk about everything we talked about there. If you want to get into more of what he had to say, including some links to some of those recommendations, you want to go over to decentralizedrevolution.com/88. You can also click the link to support what he's doing and to subscribe to the Dangerous History podcast if you haven't done that already. Thanks to my co-producer Simon Kalpin, and thanks to Dave vs. Goliath for all the music you hear on Decentralized Revolution. And of course, thanks to everyone who subscribes to the Mises PAC email list and gives to Mises PAC at takehumanaction.com. And thanks to everyone who shares, rates, reviews, and subscribes to Decentralized Revolution. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.